Susannah Vane folded her husband's letter in half and set it on the kitchen table. Not with shaking hands. Not with the particular tight-chested feeling she had been carrying for 3 years like a stone in a coat pocket. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something you have finally decided to stop carrying. And she stood there in the gray Halifax morning and understood, with a clarity that surprised even her, that she was done. The letter was not addressed to her. That was the first thing. It had been delivered to the house by mistake. Or perhaps not by mistake, because the handwriting on the envelope was familiar, and the address was only wrong by one word. Mrs. instead of Mr. She had opened it without thinking. She had opened it because in 3 years of marriage she had opened every piece of correspondence that arrived at the house on Robie Street, logged it, sorted it, responded to half of it on her husband's behalf, with his signature copied in her careful hand. She had done this because Leonard asked her to. And because in the first year she had believed this was what partnership looked like, and by the second year, she had stopped examining what it looked like, and simply continued. She read the letter. It was from a woman named Harriet Boyce, who wrote from an address, in Dartmouth, that Susannah recognized as the boarding house where Leonard stayed when his work kept him on the other side of the harbor. Harriet Boyce wrote with the easy familiarity of someone who had stopped measuring her words around a particular man. She wrote about evenings. She wrote about certain conversations. She wrote, at the end of the second page, that she wished he would stop pretending the arrangement was temporary. That it had been 18 months. That temporary had a meaning, and this was no longer it. Susannah read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and stood in the kitchen that she kept, and the house that she ran, and the life that she had assembled. Piece by careful piece, around a man who had apparently been building something else on the side, something warmer, something less convenient. Something that got 18 months of honesty she had never been offered. She was 26 years old. She had come to the house on Robie Street at 23, brought by a marriage arranged between her father's failing trading company and Leonard Vane's family money in the way that such things were arranged in Halifax in 1887, quietly and with the language of opportunity. Her father had called it a good match. Her mother had said Leonard was steady. Steady was the word they used when they meant he would not leave. It turned out steady and present were different qualities, and nobody had mentioned which one she was getting. She had not been in love with Leonard when she married him. She had been willing. She had been prepared to be. She had told herself on the morning of the wedding that love was something that grew in the right conditions, that she would tend to it, that patience was a form of devotion. What she had not understood then, and had been slowly understanding for 3 years, was that conditions required two people paying attention. Leonard paid attention to the firm, to the harbor, to his accounts and his clients and his evenings in Dartmouth, apparently, for 18 months. He had never once asked her what she thought about any of it. She picked up the letter, she put it in the pocket of her apron. She thought very carefully for a long moment, the way her father had taught her to think, before any significant accounting decision. Slowly, without emotion, following the logic to where it actually led, rather than where she hoped it was going. Then she went upstairs and took the canvas bag from the back of the wardrobe. She had kept it there since they moved in. She had never entirely unpacked her whole self into this house. She understood now. She had arranged herself within it, adapted, made it function, but there had always been some part of her standing slightly to the side of the life she was living, watching it run, and wondering when it would feel like hers. She packed efficiently, a change of clothes, dark and practical. Her mother's silver comb, which she had kept in a box at the back of the nightstand. A small notebook in which she had been recording, for the past 2 years, the household accounts in a system of her own design. A system she had inherited from her father's method and improved upon, which tracked not only what was spent but what was saved and where, and which revealed, if you read it carefully, that the Vane household ran significantly under budget because Susannah had been quietly, systematically redirecting the surplus. Not stealing. Managing. She had managed it the way she managed everything, without acknowledgement, without credit, and with enough foresight that there was now $63.40 sitting in her own name in an account at the bank on Spring Garden Road. Leonard did not know about the account. He had never asked how the household ran so smoothly on what he gave her. He had simply received the smoothness as a condition of the house. She put the notebook in the bag. She put the $63.40 in her coat pocket. She did not take the pearl earrings from the dressing table. She did not take the blue wool shawl Leonard had brought from a business trip to Boston. She took what had been hers before him, and she closed the bag, and she carried it downstairs. She did not leave a note. She had considered it. She had stood in the hallway with a pen in her hand and thought about what she would say, and then she had thought about Leonard reading it over breakfast, his expression mild and managerial, and she had put the pen down. Her words were not for him. He had shown her, over 3 years and apparently 18 months of a separate life, exactly what her words were worth. She left through the front door, which felt deliberate. The November street was cold and gray, the kind of Halifax cold that comes off the harbor like an opinion. She walked south on Robie Street, with her bag over one shoulder, and the letter in her pocket, and her coat buttoned to the collar. She did not look back at the house. She had expected to feel something when she crossed the threshold. Grief, or the complicated hollow ache of a marriage finally acknowledged as what it had always been. What she felt instead was simpler than she expected. She felt like a window opened in a room that had not had air in a very long time. She had one destination. Her mother's cousin, Agnes Strachan, kept a small house on South Street near the public gardens. Agnes was 61 years old and had never married, a fact that people in Susannah's family had always described with a particular species of pity. Susannah had been thinking about Agnes differently lately. A woman who had never handed the legal control of her finances to another person. A woman who lived in her own name. The pity, Susannah was beginning to understand, had been coming from the wrong direction. Agnes opened the door before Susannah knocked. She looked at the bag on Susannah's shoulder and the particular quality of Susannah's face, which was calm in the way that faces are calm when something enormous has just been decided, and she said, without preamble, "Come in, the kettle's on." Agnes did not ask questions that first hour. She set tea on the table and sliced bread, and sat across from Susannah with her own cup, and let the silence be what it needed to be. Susannah had always found silence uncomfortable, had always moved to fill it, had spent 3 years filling every quiet room in the house on Robie Street with careful activity, so that there was no space left for the question she didn't want to answer. She sat in Agnes's kitchen and let the silence be. Finally Agnes said, "Is it over?" "Yes," Susannah said. Agnes looked at her steadily with the eyes of a woman who had watched a great many things from the particular vantage point of a person society had written off. "Good," she said, and she did not say anything else about it. Susannah slept that night in the back room. Agnes kept made up with the unceremonious practicality of a woman who understood that people sometimes needed somewhere to land without warning. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and did not cry. She was not sure what she felt. She was not sure she needed to know yet. She would work it out the way she worked out accounts, methodically, one column at a time, not rushing the total. In the morning, Agnes put a piece of paper on the table beside the teapot. It was a name and an address. Meredith Cook, solicitor, Spring Garden Road. Agnes said, "She's the only woman solicitor in Halifax, which means she knows more than anyone else about how the law treats women who walk out of marriages, because they all end up in her office eventually." She paused. "She delivered my niece's first child before she studied law. She is not someone who gives up on difficult cases." Susannah looked at the paper. "I don't have a case. You have 6340 and a household account you've been running for 3 years, Agnes said. "You have more of a case than you think." She went to see Meredith Cook the following Tuesday. The office was up a narrow staircase above a stationer's shop, 2 small rooms with bookshelves on every wall and a desk positioned, so that whoever sat behind it had the light from the window, and whoever sat across from it had to look into it. Susannah noticed this, and thought it was probably deliberate. Meredith Cook was 43, with the direct manner of someone who had spent years having her authority questioned, and had decided to make her competence so obvious that questioning it became exhausting. She read the letter from Harriet Boyce without expression. She read it again. Then she set it on the desk. "You kept this? Yes, good." She folded her hands. "Tell me about the account on Spring Garden Road," Susannah told her. She laid it out the way her father had taught her. Facts first, interpretation after. The household budget, the system she had developed. The surplus she had accumulated over 2 years without Leonard's knowledge. The notebook, which she produced from her bag and set on the desk. Meredith Cook leafed through the notebook slowly. Her expression shifted once, briefly, at something she saw around the 3rd page. Then it settled back to neutral. "You designed this system yourself. Based on my father's method, I improved the surplus tracking column. His didn't account for irregular quarterly costs." Meredith set the notebook down. "Your husband," she said. "Does he know the household runs this way?" "He knows it runs. He doesn't know how. Has he ever asked?" "No." Meredith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to ask you something and I need an honest answer." "All right, when you read that letter." "Not when you decided to leave." when you actually read the words. Were you surprised? Susannah thought about it honestly, because the question deserved that. No, she said. I wasn't surprised. I know something was wrong in the architecture of the marriage for more than a year. I just hadn't found the specific load-bearing problem. She paused. Now I have. The corner of Meredith's mouth moved. All right, she said. Here is what we have to work with. The legal situation in Nova Scotia in 1887 was not, Meredith explained, entirely without options, though it was not generous. A wife who left the marital home without cause could be compelled to return. The definition of cause was narrow and church-adjacent and generally unfavorable to women. Adultery was grounds for judicial separation, but the evidence requirements were formal. A letter from the other party was useful. It was not sufficient on its own, but, Meredith said, and she said it the way a woman says it when the but is the whole point, there is the matter of your father's estate. Susannah went still. My father has been dead for 2 years. I know. I handled part of the estate filing. She went to the shelf behind her and pulled down a file, cloth-covered and slim. Your father's trading company was dissolved, as you know, to settle the family's debts before your marriage. What was not dissolved, because it was filed separately in your mother's family name before your parents married, is a block of warehouse space on the waterfront. Commercial lease, 3 units, generating rental income since 1871. She set the file on the desk. Under the terms of your maternal grandmother's estate, it passes to the eldest surviving female descendant of her line. Your mother had no surviving sisters. You are the only candidate. Susannah stared at her. My mother never told me. Your mother may not have known the full scope of it, Meredith said, with a gentleness that suggested she had said this before, about other mothers, other daughters, other things that women had been carefully kept from knowing. The income has been accumulating in a trust account since your mother's death last year. It has not been touched. It cannot be transferred to a spouse. The terms of your grandmother's filing are explicit on that point. She paused. Your grandmother was a precise woman. Susannah sat with that for a moment. Her grandmother, whom she had known as a stern, practical woman who smelled of camphor and kept her accounts in a ledger she never let anyone else handle, who had died when Susannah was 14 and left behind, apparently, a structure that had been quietly waiting. How much? Susannah asked. Meredith told her. It was not a fortune. It was enough. It was more than enough to begin something. Can Leonard claim any of it? Meredith leaned forward slightly. That is exactly the right question. The filing predates not only your marriage but your parents' marriage. The terms exclude spousal transfer at any generation. It is, as far as I can determine, legally isolated from any marital estate claim. She paused. He would have to contest in a Nova Scotia court. He would lose, because the filing is airtight, and because contesting it would require him to publicly present his arguments for why his wife's grandmother's independent property should be his, which is an argument that does not improve in the telling. He would still try, Susannah said. Leonard does not like losing things he considers his. Most of them do, Meredith said. She picked up the notebook and handed it back. That's why I keep records. She returned to Agnes's house that evening with the file tucked under her arm and sat at the kitchen table and told Agnes everything. Agnes listened without interrupting, her hand still on the tabletop, her eyes steady. When Susannah finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your grandmother came to me once, you know, before you were born. She was trying to find a solicitor who wouldn't dismiss her out of hand. I sent her to the man who eventually filed that paperwork. She paused. I always wondered if it would matter to anyone. It matters, Susannah said. Agnes reached across and put her hand over Susannah's, briefly, without words. She was not a woman who used words when a hand would do. 3 weeks later, Leonard came. Susannah had been expecting him. She had been preparing for him the way you prepare for weather you can see on the horizon. Not with dread, but with attention. She knew how Leonard operated in a dispute. She had watched him manage clients, suppliers, employees, the particular machinery of his professional authority. He was not a man who shouted. He was a man who arranged the room, so that you felt the unreasonableness of disagreeing with him before he said a word. He appeared on Agnes's step on a Wednesday afternoon, and Agnes, who had the excellent judgment of a woman who had managed her own affairs for 40 years, opened the door and said, She's in the sitting room, and then walked to the kitchen and closed the door behind her, leaving them the front room. Susannah was standing when he came in. She had chosen to stand. Leonard looked different than she remembered, which was strange, because it had been less than a month. He looked like a man who had not been quite sure what he was coming to say, which was new. Leonard always knew what he was going to say. Susannah, he said. Leonard, she said. He looked around Agnes's sitting room with the expression of a man who finds the territory unfamiliar and is calculating what that means. Then he looked back at her. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Whatever you think you read in that letter, I know what I read," she said. "So do you. Let's not have that conversation." He studied her face. She had spent 3 years watching him do this. The quick assessment, the recalibration, the pivot to a different approach. She recognized all of it. She let him look. "Come home," he said. "We can discuss the other matter privately. Whatever arrangements would help." "No," she said. The word was small and complete, and she watched it land on him. He had not expected no. He had expected negotiation. He had expected the careful, accommodating Susannah who had spent 3 years finding the path of least friction. "Susannah, be reasonable. The house, your position, your reputation." "My reputation," she said, "has been managed by me for 3 years, while you spent 18 months building a separate life in Dartmouth." "My position in the house?" "Was the house. I ran it, Leonard. I ran the accounts. I managed the staff. I maintained your social calendar and wrote half your correspondence and hosted your clients and made your professional life function." She kept her voice even. "I am not angry about the work. I'm angry that you called it convenience. That you took it as a condition of your comfort without ever once asking how it was done." He was very still. She had never spoken to him this way. She had never been quite sure she was allowed to, which she understood now was the problem. "There's also the matter of my grandmother's estate," she said, "which I've been to see a solicitor about. You'll be hearing from Meredith Cook's office this week." Something shifted in his face. A very small movement, recalculation again, but underneath the calculation she saw something she had not expected. Something that was not quite guilt and not quite remorse but was adjacent to both. The expression of a man who has just understood, perhaps for the first time, the actual scale of what he has been doing. "The warehouse units," she said. "The waterfront. My grandmother's filing from 1871. I would not advise contesting it." "I wasn't," he said. "And it came out differently than she expected. Quieter, like a man reading a map that does not match the territory he thought he was standing in." They looked at each other for a moment in Agnes's sitting room, in the gray Halifax afternoon, in the wreckage of something that had never been quite solid enough to count as a marriage. "What do you want?" he said finally. "A formal separation," she said. "Filed quietly and completely. My name off the household accounts. My grandmother's estate in my own name, no contest. In exchange, I don't require you to account for 18 months in Dartmouth in a public proceeding." She paused. "You know as well as I do, which version of this is better for your business relationships." Leonard looked at her for a long time. "You planned this," he said. "I've had 3 weeks to think," she said. "I think clearly when I'm not spending my energy managing someone else's household." He stood there another moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not quite name, and did not particularly need to. Then he nodded, once, the nod of a man who has just made the calculation and found only one answer. "I'll speak to my solicitor," he said. "Miss Cook will be in touch," Susannah said. He left. Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway before the sound of his footsteps on the street had faded. "Your hands," Agnes said. Susannah looked down. Her hands were in fact entirely steady. "I wasn't scared of him," she said. She was slightly surprised by this as she said it. "I was scared of the idea of him for years. The idea that I needed his goodwill to function, but he walked in and I just..." She stopped. "I could see exactly how he worked. Like a clock with the casing off." Agnes said, "You spent 3 years learning the mechanism." "Yes." Susannah sat down. "I didn't know that was what I was doing." Agnes sat across from her. "Most education happens that way," she said. "You don't know what you're learning until you need to use it." The papers came through from Meredith's office 6 weeks later. Leonard had not contested the warehouse estate. He had filed for the quiet separation on the terms Susannah had outlined, and Meredith had walked it through the relevant channels, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, and had, as she put it to Susannah, pre-positioned certain arguments with the relevant clerk last spring. "Because I saw this type of case coming." Susannah read the final document at the table in Agnes's kitchen with Agnes beside her, and a woman named Dolores Sutherland sitting across from her. Because Dolores had arrived from Truro the week before, with a letter of introduction from Meredith, and a situation that Meredith described only as requiring a steady head, and someone who understood Nova Scotia property law from the inside. Dolores was 31 and had been running her deceased father-in-law's farm accounts for 4 years, while her husband pursued interests in Halifax. She had the particular careful intelligence of a woman who has had to hide what she knows for long enough that hiding it has become automatic. The filing is confirmed, Susannah said, setting the document down. The warehouse estate transfers to my name effective this week. She looked at Dolores. Now, tell me what you actually understand about farm accounts, not what you've been allowed to say you understand. All of it. Dolores blinked. She was not used to being asked this way. I know, Susannah said. It's unusual. It's the right way. She held Dolores's eyes and waited. Dolores began to talk. By February of 1888, the rental income from the warehouse units had funded the conversion of the back 2 rooms of Agnes's house into something between a records office and a reading room. Agnes had offered the space without ceremony, moving her own things to the front rooms, with the cheerful practicality of a woman who had always believed space should be used for something that mattered. Susannah kept records there. Property records, estate filings, the particular legal geography of what women in Nova Scotia owned or were owed, or had been quietly accumulating in their grandmother's names without knowing it. Meredith sent cases. Agnes sent women she had known for 40 years who were now in circumstances that required someone who understood both the law and the arithmetic. Susannah taught Dolores how to read a property filing. She taught a woman named Florence, who had arrived in December from a situation in Pictou County, how to keep a surplus account that could not be observed in an ordinary household review. She was not running a charity. She was running a resource. Information was what she offered, clear, complete, without the soft edges of condescension that women were so often handed instead of facts. She heard from Leonard twice. Once through Meredith, a question about a household item, resolved in 3 sentences. Once through a mutual acquaintance who reported that Leonard had moved to Toronto to pursue a business partnership. She received this information with the mild interest of someone hearing news about a country she had once visited, but had no plans to return to. Eli Stroud came into all of it sideways, the way the useful things tend to arrive. He was a land surveyor who worked primarily around the Halifax waterfront, which meant his work occasionally intersected with the warehouse units Susannah now managed. He had come to the office on Agnes's back rooms in October to discuss a boundary discrepancy on the eastern lot, and had spent 40 minutes talking through a surveying problem with Susannah, who had read enough of her grandmother's property filings by then to follow the technical language without difficulty. When he finished, he had said, with the simple directness of a man who said exactly what he meant and left the rest out, "You know more about waterfront property law than most of the solicitors I work with. I've had reason to learn quickly," she said. "That's a particular kind of learning," he said. "It goes in deeper." He came back the following month with another survey question. Then he came back to drop off a revised boundary map. Then, one Tuesday in December, he arrived with no professional reason at all, and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I was passing and I wondered if you'd eaten." She had looked at him for a moment. This quiet man who asked questions and waited for the full answer, and had never once talked over her in the middle of a technical explanation. "I haven't," she said. "There's a good place on Barrington Street," he said. "If you're not in the middle of something." She had been in the middle of something, as she was always in the middle of something. She had looked at the file on the desk, and then at Eli Stroud, who was watching her, with the patience of a man who would wait, and would not make the waiting feel like pressure. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. He waited. They had been in the habit of it since then, nothing declared, nothing arranged, a practical, ongoing presence of 2 people who found each other's company useful and honest and, increasingly, more than that. One evening in March, walking back from Barrington Street through the cold harbor smell of Halifax at night, he said, "What are you building, exactly, in the back rooms?" She thought about it. "A record," she said, "of what women in this province actually own, or are owed, or could claim if someone told them the right questions to ask, and the people who can help them ask." She paused. "My grandmother built something like it, in her way. She filed a document in 1871 that saved me in 1887. She never knew if it would matter. She just built it and trusted that someone would eventually need it." Ely walked beside her in the way he did everything, without taking up more space than he needed, without positioning himself in front. "And now you're building the version that's louder," he said. "Slightly louder," she said. "The legal system still requires you to know the right doors. I'm trying to mark them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The survey work I do on the eastern waterfront, there are 3 parcels that have unclear inheritance records going back to the 1860s. At least one of them traces to a woman's family line." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "I wasn't sure if it was relevant to what you do," he said. "Now I think it probably is." She looked at him, this man who had turned up with survey maps and stayed to ask the right questions, who had never once told her what she should do with the information she kept finding. "Tell me about the parcels," she said. He told her. She listened all the way back to Agnes's house, and when they reached the step she took out her notebook and wrote 3 things down. And he read what she wrote and added a detail she had missed, and she wrote that too. "Come inside," she said. "Agnes will have tea." He came inside. Agnes, who had the excellent judgment of a woman who understood everything worth understanding about people, looked at the two of them and said nothing whatsoever. She simply put 3 cups on the table. In April, Meredith confirmed the first of the waterfront parcels. A woman named Netta Burgess, 67 years old, originally from Dartmouth, discovered through Eli's survey records that a section of commercial property her father had registered in her name in 1863. A registration her husband had believed dissolved by their marriage, because he had never read the original filing closely enough to understand it wasn't dissolvable, was still, in the eyes of the law, hers. Netta Burgess came to the back rooms on Agnes's house on a Friday morning in April, brought by Meredith, and Susannah walked her through the filing documents with the same directness she had first encountered from Agnes and from Meredith herself. Not softened, not managed, just information, clearly given. At the end of it, Netta said, "My husband thought he knew everything I had." "They usually do," Susannah said. "That's why we keep records." The spring settled into summer, the Halifax harbor going from gray to something approaching bright, the garden at Agnes's house coming into the uncelebrated bloom of a northern spring, modest and practical and determined. Susannah walked to the waterfront most mornings to check on the warehouse units, and on 3 out of 5 mornings Eli came with his survey maps and his precise, unhurried way of being useful. She was not the woman who had set a letter on a kitchen table in November and walked out of a house on Robie Street. She was. But the woman who had done that was only just becoming visible, the way something submerged becomes visible when the water clears. She had always been there. She had simply been required, for 3 years, to make herself convenient, and she had been obedient enough, and patient enough, and finally tired enough to stop. The work continued. Meredith sent cases. Dolores became, by June, indispensable in the records room with the fierce competence of someone given a tool she had always been capable of using. Florence stayed, and then another woman arrived, and then 2 more, and the rooms on Agnes's South Street were beginning to overflow with the particular productive crowding of a space being asked to do more than it was designed for. On a morning in July, Agnes found Susannah at the writing desk before the household was properly awake, the ledger open, 3 files spread alongside it, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. Agnes set down a fresh cup. She looked at the spread of papers with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to see exactly this. "What are you thinking?" Agnes asked. "I'm thinking we need more space," Susannah said. She looked up. "The Eastern Warehouse Unit, the one on the end. The current tenant's lease expires in August." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant use of the property." "It's the right use," Susannah said. "Ground floor, harbor access, central. Room for files, room for consultations, room for women to sit and read documents without feeling like they're imposing on someone's kitchen." She paused. "My grandmother left me property. She left it specifically so a man couldn't take it. I think the most accurate way to honor that is to use it for exactly the thing she was protecting against." Agnes sat down across from her. The morning light came through the window at the angle it only reached in July, warm and direct, and for a moment the kitchen looked the way it had looked when Susannah arrived in November, raw and exhausted and carrying a canvas bag and 63.40 cents. It looked different now. She looked different. Not harder, not tougher in the brittle way that comes from being fought. Different the way a tree looks after a storm has passed through, bending having turned out not to mean breaking. "Your grandmother," Agnes said finally, "would say that naming it after yourself is premature." "I know," Susannah said. "I'm not naming it after myself." Agnes raised her eyebrows. "I'm calling it the Strachan Room," Susannah said. "After you." Agnes was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the table, at the ledger, at the cold tea she had not yet touched. She was not a woman who cried, but something moved across her face that was close to it, close enough. "That," Agnes said finally, "is the most inconvenient thing you have done since you arrived on my doorstep." "You'll manage," Susannah said. Agnes looked at her. Then she made the sound that was not quite a laugh and picked up her cup and said nothing further, which was, from Agnes, the closest thing to full agreement Susannah had ever received. Outside, the harbor was beginning its morning activity, the particular sounds of Halifax at work. Ships and commerce and the cold salt smell of a city that had been built on exactly this kind of stubborn, unglamorous necessary labor. Susannah opened the ledger to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. Below it she wrote, Strachan Room, Eastern Warehouse Unit, August lease expiry. Begins with whatever is needed. Continues as long as there is need. She set down her pen and looked at what she had written. Then she picked it up again and wrote one more line. My grandmother filed a document in 1871 and trusted it would matter. She was right. Now we build the part she didn't have time for. She closed the ledger. Through the kitchen window, the harbor caught the first full light of the morning and held it, steady and unspectacular and entirely its own.